Hi, welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour. I'm joined this week by my very good friend and the guy who started this podcast, Gadi Taub. Gadi is a historian at Hebrew University, and for the first, I think, 30 episodes of this show, more or less,
we did them together.
Right, we did it together. It was the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour with Gadi Taub, and now Gadi Taub is joining.
Now it's with or without.
Now it's with or without Gadi Taub. So this week, thankfully, it's with, much to my delight, and I hope your erudition, because Gadi is one of the smarter people that I know. One of the smartest people that I know.
And, wow, it's worth coming on your show, Carolyn. I'll take this compliment with me all day.
Well, we don't do this enough, so I have to flatter you to make sure you come back. Anyway,
today we have some optimistic things to say. Yesterday was Mitzad Galim, the flag
parade
in Jerusalem, and it was flooded with people. I don't know how much the left-wing media said, but probably times 4, whatever they said. They said 8,000, I think. It was probably 30,000. And everyone predicted that it would be doom. I remember getting an SMS from you telling, are they going to say World War III is going to start after the flag parade? And none of that happened, as opposed to last year when we tried to walk on our tiptoes and all we got was rockets and violence from Arabs in Jerusalem.
We got pogroms. I mean, they had started a few weeks before Jerusalem Day, and then Hamas fired missiles on Jerusalem while people were dancing at the Kotel with the flag. So it was a split screen that was it was eminently predictable and predicted. And in fact, it happened. And this week, what was so strange was that the warnings coming from the media and coming from the government that Hamas was going to strike if we dared to have a flag parade were so hysterical that it didn't appear. I mean, it was pretty clear. It was like they were asking Hamas to attack. I mean, they were, and on the other hand, they were begging Hamas not to attack, and they were using Egyptian mediation with Hamas to try to convince Hamas not to attack us when we allowing Israelis to march with the flag in the old city of Jerusalem. So, I mean, it was really the warnings that preceded the parade were so dark and cataclysmic that it was hard to avoid the conclusion that they were asking for it. It was very strange.
But I think this is yet one more demonstration that the logic of appeasement just doesn't work. It's if you're dealing with bullies, then you have to take a strong stance and you have to walk erect and carry your flag proudly and unapologetically, because otherwise it's not that they kept saying it's a provocation. No, it's not a provocation. It's a demonstration of our will, and when you demonstrate your will, others appreciate it. This is why, as our good friend Mike Duran argued about Trump's Middle East policy, when he went ahead and killed Soleimani, when Iran was being too cheeky. And that works because they understand it, because states who are warmongers and bullies, the language they understand is power. And if you try the language of flattery instead, then they understand you're weak and they step all over you. It's that simple.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And actually, I want to talk a little bit about where we stand right now, particularly vis-a-vis Israeli Arabs, having gotten through a successful Jerusalem Day, because one of the things that we've been experiencing of late is terrorism. It's true from Israeli Arabs. Half of the murderous terrorist attacks that we experienced in March and in April were carried out by Israeli Arab citizens. And most recently, there was a plot by Hamas members of a cell inside of Jerusalem, not in Judea and Samaria, to assassinate a member of Knesset Itamar Ben-Gvir. So that a lot of the terrorism is being carried out by Israeli Arabs. But it's not just that. We had a poll that came out 2 weeks ago that showed that 75% of Israeli Arabs don't accept Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, meaning, as Israel. And we've seen a lot of really blatant demonstrations of disloyalty to Israel, loyalty to the Palestinians, mobilization on behalf of the Palestinians and against Israelis by Israeli Arabs over the past year, since the pogroms, of course, last year in mixed Arab-Israeli cities, where they literally rioted and killed and burned Jewish property and Jewish people, in one instance in Akko. And so we're having this situation that is unprecedented. It's really, I wrote on Twitter yesterday that what it really, if you wanted to look for a parallel, it would be the Palestinian uprising in 1987, as opposed to anything else, where they just stopped cooperating with Israel on a civilian level and from a terrorist level. But now we're seeing it inside of Israel itself. So yesterday we had a good day with flags, but it's not clear how long that's going to be able to maintain itself with under the prevailing circumstances, where you have a government that's essentially dependent on Israeli Arab parties that reject Israel's right to exist for its very existence.
Yeah, and on the Muslim Brotherhood, what is being
Muslim Brotherhood political party that's a member of the coalition.
But even more, the talk is about civil cooperation, right? Those who are protecting or defending this post-Zionist coalition are saying, look, it's a good sign. We are now the Ram party, the party of the Islamic movement, is going to put on hold all its political plans and just go for civil cooperation in economics, in the civil service, and whatnot. And what they're not taking into account is that everywhere the Muslim Brotherhood operates in the same way. So now they have flooded it with a 5-year plan and 53 billion shekels. It's an enormous sum, and this is all going to civil cooperation. So where is the civil cooperation going? It's going to finance mosques where young people would be radicalized. It's going to education, which is basically giving the Muslim Brotherhood educational autonomy to spread its propaganda and its long-term plans. And it's going into municipalities which are notoriously corrupt, and as we know from a recent 5-year plan, which was under the Bibi government, much smaller but intended with good intentions, not just the coalition bribes, but intending to open the economic prospects of the Arab population. And we know where that money went, because even Ayelet Shaked, who now regrettably serves as the Minister of Interior, said that based on intelligence that she got, a lot of the money that the Netanyahu government intended for economic improvement, for infrastructure improvement, and the rest of it just ended up in the hands of crime organizations, which have skyrocketed in the last 5 years in their size.
I want to just add 3 examples, real life examples of what you were talking about. First is education. So Eliyahu K, a new Oleh from South Africa, was killed earlier this year or late last year, I can't remember, in Jerusalem, and he was killed by a Jerusalem Arab resident who was a teacher, and he was in his late 40s. He was married, he had many children, and he was a school teacher in Tzur Bacher, a neighborhood in southern Jerusalem by Talpiot, not far from the American embassy. So that's one. Another thing is that the terrorists who carried out the attack in April in Hadera were from the very large Arab city in the Galilee, Al-Fahim. And after, and they were killed by border guard policemen who happened to be having dinner basically right next to the place he opened fire. So they were able to prevent a major massacre, and only 2 people were killed instead of dozens, because they were like the guy in Texas. I mean, in terms of the amount of firepower they had. And then the next day or 2 days later, the mayor's office, the city hall of El-Fahim put out a condolence announcement on its website, mourning the loss of the two terrorists. Yeah. And so that's municipalities. And then the third thing was crime. And so we see nationalists, that is Palestinian nationalist or Islamic supremacist crime being carried out in massive scale against Jews in protection rings and other things by Arab Israelis all over the country, whether it's agricultural theft or this week, I think on Sunday morning, the first news brief that I saw when I woke up was that 8 buses in Kiryat Shmona in the north had been burned in their parking lot, and that the suspicion of the police was that it was to intimidate the bus company into paying protection to one of the Arab Israeli crime gangs or punish them for not paying protection. So, we're having these kinds of things every day on all 3 different levels, on the level of education, on the level of municipalities that are disloyal to Israel, that and organized crime that's also directed specifically for political violence against Jews.
Where is this headed in the long run, in your opinion?
I think that you got it right at the outset, and I think that you've probably made this argument as well, which is that, you said that you can't appease people into respecting you and into wanting to and into respecting your authority, and that the only way to push back against this is to have a government in Israel that won't abide by it, that won't accept it, that make it very clear that these are the rules of the game, and if you don't follow them, you're out of the game. You cannot participate in this game. We have laws on the books that are not respected by the Supreme Court. None of these Arab parties, I think, or at least 2 of them, certainly Ram and Balad, should not be in the Knesset because they're openly rejecting Israel's right to exist. And under the basic law, which is like Israel's constitution, such as it is, without a constitution of the Knesset, parties that don't accept Israel's right to exist, that support terrorist organizations, that support acts of terrorism and war against Israel, things that both of these parties openly do. And you can make an argument that Ahmed Tibi's party as well, Tal, does the exact same thing, are not allowed to run for the Knesset. And yet,
their platforms are in various degrees of clarity denying our right to self-determination by supporting what they call the right of return, which is not a right and not a return, but is a carte blanche for the descendants of any Palestinian to enter and receive citizenship in the state of Israel, not in the Palestinian territories, not under the Palestinian Authority, but in Israel proper. So this runs in direct contradiction to what is called Basic Law Knesset, the semi-constitutional law that regulates the procedures of our legislature. And therein it says that you cannot run for the Knesset if you are a racist party or if you reject the Jewish character of the state. That is, if you do not accept the idea that Israel is a Jewish democratic state. But what happens, and I'm not telling you because we Israelis know this frustratingly often, what happens is that the committee, which is supposed to register a party, the election committee, the election committee, again and again.
Which is chaired by a Supreme Court justice who essentially holds total power over the decisions of the committee, right?
But the committee rejects them, and then the Supreme Court overrules the committee.
That's why the Supreme Court justice, his position reflects the views of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court president is the one who decides who's going to adjudicate every petition to the Supreme Court. So the Central Elections Committee rejects the right of these parties that don't abide by the basic law to run for Knesset. So they do so in accordance to the law, very clearly set out in the statute. And then the Arab parties petition the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturns the lawful ruling of the Central Elections Committee. So that's what happens in election after election after election. And that's why these people are able to run. That's why they're able to command a monopoly support among Arab Israelis, because they also crowd everybody else out of the room. So, if 75% of Arab Israelis reject Israel's right to exist under the current atmosphere, you could say it's pretty amazing the 25% said they accept it, because it's an atmosphere of total intimidation. We saw it in the Knesset this week or last week when Ida Suleiman, a member of Knesset, is she from Balad? I don't remember, from the Joint Arab List, which is a pro-terrorist, anti-Israel party that isn't officially a member of the coalition, but they essentially will not allow this government to fall because they don't want the right to return to power. At any rate, so she's sitting in the Education Committee of the Knesset. And this young man, Yosef Haddad, an Arab Israeli, came in and he was giving testimony before the committee, such as it is. And she started shouting him down.
And he's a Zionist.
Right.
So
I buried the least. So Yosef Haddad is a really great guy. I'm going to have him on this show as well. He's an Arab Christian Israeli, and he's extremely patriotic, and he's one of the 25% who not only supports but revels in Israel and in its Jewish statehood. And he goes around the world and he tells people he's an ambassador, of Israel to the world. And so he came and he was speaking at the Education Committee, and she called him a collaborator and threw him out of the committee. And we can get into that, but the point is that she basically put a price on his head by calling him a collaborator, right? Because that in the Palestinian Authority, collaborators are subject immediately to extrajudicial execution, where they're thrown by the side of the road and then they can't get buried, and if they're Muslim, in Muslim cemeteries. And here you have a member of Knesset sitting in Knesset calling him a collaborator, which is essentially saying to people, you can kill him at will. And she's allowed to run for Knesset. And so, this is the problem. And when she's allowed to run for the Knesset, you're not going to be able to get parties that are representing the interests of Arab Israelis that accept Israel's right to exist into the Knesset, because these people are goons and they're scary and they're mafias. And like you said, they have an enormous amount of state resources that they abscond with to fund their nefarious operations, whether they're open or whether they're behind the scenes, against anybody who will stand up and say that they want to be Israelis and they want to live in this country. I was speaking to a colleague of mine, a wonderful Arab journalist named Khaled Abu Tuam, and he said, look, what do you want from the Arabs of Lod? What do you want from the Arabs of Akko? That they're supposed to stand up for Israel against their neighbors, when the Israeli police last year and this year, when people riot in Jerusalem and they attack and they beat up policemen, they're arrested, and then 5 hours later they're let out of jail and they're sitting in cafes in the east in eastern Jerusalem, smoking hookah pipes and drinking black coffee as if nothing happened. He said, how and a lot of these people are criminals. So how are law-abiding Arab Israeli citizens supposed to stand up for Israel when the Israeli legal system is giving every single one of them get out of jail free cards? And he has a very, very important point here. You cannot expect people to stand up against the mob if the government doesn't go to war against the mob.
I have two comments on that. First, that I think this is going to boil over, because if you have riots and your reaction to riots is what you say it is, and the judicial system just lets them off the hook based on the progressive belief that if you're generous to criminal, they will reciprocate, you will only get an increased wave. And the second point is that they have an enormous amount of weapons now, especially the Bedouin sector. I interviewed Meir Deutsch from the Regavim NGO, who wrote a book called Bedouistan, How Israel is Losing the Negev. And we're basically giving them, it's like a state within a state. They've got, the law doesn't apply there. And they steal weapons from Tzahal, and Tzahal soldiers are not allowed.
But it's not just the IDF. I mean, you have to remember that at this point, the IDF, that what you're describing and what Meir is describing is a phenomenon that has been going on for years, but the army is actually better at protecting their armories today than they were in the past. The vast majority of weapons, unfortunately, now that are streaming in, to the extent they're streaming into the Israeli Muslim, is from Jordan. They're coming across the Jordanian border into the South, from the Jordan Valley into the South Hebron Hills, and then going across into the Negev. So that's the rat line now more than the army, but they do have an enormous quantity of weapons. Yes.
And so where this is heading, in my opinion, is that the next round of pogroms is going to be armed. And therefore we will have something, God forbid, akin to a civil war within the Israeli population.
Which is why I think that the aspect of the rebellion is so key here. I mean, we talked about it, and you guys can watch. I think it was like episode, 47 or something that I had with Gadi last time we were talking about Arab Israelis, and he showed Meir's book, which shows the whole Negev painted in green, because that's the Bedouin country essentially. And Israel, the government just approved, or the Knesset just approved 740 million shekels to be transferred to these local authorities, which essentially is giving them the means to become an autonomy. So this is all very upsetting. But I think, last year we had acts of it's insurrection, where you have, most of the truck drivers in Israel are Arab Israelis, and they were refusing to move military equipment, I think it was, from place to place during the last round of hostilities with Hamas, so that we have grown dependent on trusting of this integration of Arab Israelis into Israeli society. And when they turn their back on Israel, as happened with the Palestinians in 1987 in Judea and Samaria and Gaza with the uprising, we're finding ourselves in a real pickle. I mean, we need to be able to replace them, because we're going to be facing this war when the people who are waging it, whether it's doctors and truck drivers and electricians and I don't know what, are going to be on the other side.
But it all goes back to their growing sense, and I think their estimation is regrettably accurate, that there is a lapse of will on our side to defend ourselves, to defend our national symbols, to what we call tzidkat haderech, the belief in the
justice of our cause.
In the justice of our cause, exactly. And when they sense this, they begin to nibble it first on the margins, and at one point they're going to try and strike at the center. I think we're strong enough to withstand that, but the price is going to be terrible.
I think that every day that this government continues, when I was talking about it in an interview that I did with Alex Trayman on JNS at the Conservatism conference that we both spoke at last week with the Tikva Center, I think that the price that we're going to be paying when, it's time to pay the piper increases with each passing day that this government exists, which sort of puts into a weird contrast, right? How successful yesterday was and the Jerusalem Day parade, that so many people were able to come and revel in the unification of the city on the one hand, whereas last year they couldn't. I mean, people forget, and and reasonably, because you can't remember these things, but the reason that there was no parade last year was because Benny Gantz, who was the vice prime minister, blocked it, and he wouldn't permit it. There was a huge standoff between Netanyahu and Gantz had veto power over everything under this absurd law that Netanyahu had to pass in order to bring him into the coalition, where he got to veto every decision that Netanyahu made. And so he said that there could not be a flag parade, and so there wasn't. And it did invite the aggression. I mean, we never had, last year when we had the Arab rebellions, people say, well, Netanyahu was in charge. Well, actually, nobody was in charge. We've never had a weaker government than we had in May 2021. It was the low point of Israeli governance in history. And so they saw an opportunity and they took it. And I think that goes back to your question and also your answer and my answer, which is that in order to be respected, you have to command respect, and to command respect, you need many things. But one of the things that you need is a government capable of doing the kinds of things that you need to do to command respect. The last government, the last waning days of Netanyahu in power before we got the current government, we didn't have such a government at all. And since he left power, and Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz formed their government with the other breakaway right-wing parties, the right-wing defectors, the never Bibi right-wingers, dependent on the Muslim Brotherhood, we've had this weird situation where on the one hand, we don't have any missiles from Gaza, but we don't have any missiles from Gaza because we have Gaza's representative in Israeli politics, the Ram Muslim Brotherhood Party, that exercises veto control over every government action.
Yeah. So still, Caroline, good news, the flag parade. It was a demonstration of the power, the health, the common sense of large swaths of Israeli society, and the attempts to portray it as proto-fascism and to take some, I don't know, marginal characters who shouted hateful slogans, and to make this connection, as the left always does, as if the flag and the most ugly expressions of fascism are one and the same, so that if you dare raise your own flag, you are at least a potential fascist.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I was there yesterday as well. And one of the things that was so palpable everywhere was just how happy everybody is, and I mean that it wasn't, it was an incredibly happy day. People were happy to celebrate the unity of Jerusalem, happy to celebrate Jerusalem, happy to hold the flag. I mean, that's the other thing, is that there's so much to Israeli patriotism, Zionism is so deep. I mean, its roots are so enormous. They're 4,000 years old, and they're so rich and powerful, and there's so much to celebrate. And yet, we find these trivial, the media makes everything so nothing. It's like, it's just so shallow. You can't understand the depths of people's joy at Jerusalem and the liberation of Jerusalem 55 years ago by reading anything in the newspaper, because none of it wants to tell you anything, and then you never see it. And yet, that if you just, the pure joy on people's faces yesterday when they were walking with their families was it was wonderful. And it does show, when how incredibly powerful the Israeli people are. And I really feel very similar when I look at the United States under the Biden administration, that you see these great peoples, these great nations that are just being oppressed by these governments and by these ruling classes that just hate them, you know?
Yeah. This is the core of it all, in my opinion, is that if you look at the project of the new elites, what they really hate is their fellow citizens, the deplorables, the irredeemables, the clingers, whatever you want to call them, the chachachim here, the bibistim here. What they really mean when they say populism is that they hate the populace. That's the heart of it.
I think you're right. I think that that's a key insight here. And, you know, that really brings us to the second conversation that I wanted to have with you. We only have like 45 minutes for this whole show, so I think we should just pivot for the last 15 minutes or so of our conversation to Netanyahu's criminal trial that's ongoing now. And so just to update, you know, people who aren't really watching this. So Netanyahu was indicted for bribery and breach of trust. And so breach of trust is sort of a catch-all nothing indictment or charge. And the real one, the thing that got him out of government was that he was charged with bribery. And the bribery was bizarre to begin with, because the statute, the definition of bribery was artificially and illegally expanded in order to charge Netanyahu. He didn't receive any material benefit from any regulatory favors, which is generally what the statute says about bribery. You're supposed to, a bribe is money, you know, it's some material benefit. What they said was that Netanyahu received good press coverage from this very minor website that nobody reads called Walla, in exchange for regulatory benefits that he gave to a telecommunications company, Bezeq, that was owned at the time by Walla's owner. And the idea that the thing that a politician could get in the form of a bribe was positive coverage is insane, because essentially it criminalizes both journalism and politics, because every politician wants good coverage and journalists deal with politicians every day. So this was a novel, revolutionary concept that's totally insane by the Israel's prosecutions to redefine a statute without any legislative involvement for bribery, to say that it includes seeking or providing a politician with positive media coverage. And then that charge fell apart because it worked out that the website in question gave Netanyahu terrible coverage. He had almost uniformly horrible coverage, both of himself and of his wife and his kids, especially. And if you compare it to the coverage that his political rivals received, there's absolutely no comparison. They received slobbering coverage from this website. And he and his wife in particular were castigated as, you know, Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette and horrible people that should have their heads chopped off. So that was that. And so then they said, well, okay, he didn't receive positive coverage, so let's change the statute again and say that he received
unusual responsiveness. I wondered how to.
That's a great translation. They answered his spokesman's phone calls when he called to complain about a lousy article about the prime minister or his family. So this brings it to a level of resolution of an initial absurdity that's so crazy that this is what this is how they based the charge that Netanyahu committed or accepted a bribe, that he received unreasonable or unusual responsiveness, which amounted to nothing.
To his demands. And then at one point, the judges said, or one of them said, you know, you're talking about the forest, but we haven't seen the trees. You didn't bring the trees. Where are the incidents of unusual responsiveness to Netanyahu's demands to either take down articles from this negligible site or to publish something? And so the Attorney General came back with a list of 315 items in which it said that Netanyahu's requests influenced the coverage. And about half of them were just simply not true. And you know why? You think, are they lying? Are they just sloppy? Well, sloppy. Apparently, at least also sloppy, because what they did is they had the text messages from the editor, and what they brought is that as the 315 incidents is when the editor said he will do it, not when he did it. So a Netanyahu spokesperson would say, why do you publish this shit about Netanyahu's son? And the editor say, okay, we'll take it down, and didn't take it down. But they didn't check the site. They just checked.
Wait, that's just on the one side. That's on the one side. So all of these allegations have been shown in court to be false. They've had 12. They had like 12 different witnesses. Their star witness, one after the other came up as prosecution witnesses, and they all came down having destroyed the prosecution's case and strengthened the defense. And then they got to the regulatory side. So what was the regulatory role that Netanyahu played in the telecommunications company that the owner of this website owned at the time, Bezek? And it was, and so it's all about getting internet coverage to the periphery of Israel, to the smaller towns outside of the large cosmopolitan areas of Israel. At any rate, to make a long story short, for the past 3 weeks, I think, the former head of the communications ministry that Netanyahu was briefly the minister of,
Director General he was. He's not, under the minister.
He was a director general under Netanyahu, who was the prime minister, and among other things, also the communications minister. So his name is Shlomo Filbert, and he's a longtime advisor to Netanyahu. He was supposed to be the guy showing that Netanyahu directed him to give all of these regulatory advantages to Bezek, the telecommunications firm. And what he showed was that Netanyahu did nothing. He had no role. And the evidence that he did was based on illegal wiretaps of Filbert carried out by the prosecution. And they got it all wrong. And so I want to go into that because, so first we've shown that Netanyahu didn't actually get a bribe that's worth anything. And it's not a bribe under the statute. It's just a made up concept for bribery for the purpose of indicting him for bribery. And even under the concept of bribery that they invented twice, first positive coverage, and then what did you call it? Unreasonable, unusual responsiveness. Unusual responsiveness. He also didn't get that. But so he didn't get a bribe. And now the question is whether he gave anything. And here too, the answer is no, but it's even worse than that, because to get the information, which has been proven to be false, the prosecution behaved and the police completely unlawfully. So you want to explain a little bit about what we've discovered about the basis of the prosecution to begin with Filbert?
Yeah, maybe I should start with this morning's news, because their whole case rested on the idea that there was what they called, you'll have me translate this, Gishat Anchaya, the meeting of instruction.
That Netanyahu directed him to do something, that they had a conversation and he gave him a direct order, essentially, instructions for how to behave towards regulatory issues regarding Bezek.
And this was expressed in a motion of the hand. Now they built a whole
with a hand motion that he said, do this, do that, do this, whatever.
Yeah, but the whole thing is completely invented. And I use the term invented. People I wrote this in Haaretz, and I'm getting attacked for it, but I stand behind it because it was invented. First of all, there was no talk of this meeting until they broke him and made him sign a state witness agreement. Then suddenly there was this meeting. There is no external evidence of this meeting, no text messages before it, no entries in the schedules of both parties, and they fixed it on a date. And then they had the ikunim, how do you say, the locations of the...
Yeah, they had located everybody by their cell phones.
And saw that the meeting couldn't have taken place on the date that they said it could have taken place. So they asked to change the indictment to accommodate a new date. But the whole thing was invented. And now this morning, I don't know if you saw this, Carmen. This is happening right now this morning.
As we're taping this show.
As we're taping this show, the trial goes on. And this morning, Netanyahu's defense team has shown that well, I have to say what the Attorney General said. The Attorney General said, well, the part when Filber originally testified to the existence of this instruction meeting, well, it's not recorded in our videos because, gosh darn, there was an electric shutdown.
This
outage,
is while
outage.
they were interrogating, while the police, police interrogations, everything is videotaped, right? Yeah. So here, suddenly the 10 minutes, it's just like the Nixon tapes. I mean, literally, or Page and Strzok's texts that suddenly, all of the really important ones were deleted completely, or Hillary's server, she bleached it all out, and weirdly, all of her yoga meetings were gone. But here too, because they lost this specific 10-minute segment of
where the key was to everything. And right. Now people who know the police said this is bullshit from the beginning, because they have backup generators. This is Lav 433. It's like the police elite.
It's the FBI.
Yeah. But this morning. Attorney Benzu from Netanyahu's legal team showed that other interrogations were going on at the same time, and lo and behold, there were no electricity outages on any other interrogation. So now it's we're saying Tikim Tfurim, that Netanyahu was framed, and every day comes another piece of news that the other side is cheating. They're playing dirty. They have fought tooth and nail to hide documents which suggest that Netanyahu is not guilty. They have refused to. They have been caught repeatedly not giving the defense team some of the evidence on which,
and also tampering with evidence.
Yeah, and taking lines out of the tiblul.
Out of the transcripts of everything.
Yeah, and I'm missing too many technical terms here. And so, but this charade goes on. And if we were in the United States, by now, judges would have declared a mistrial. But first of all, in Israel, there's no such procedure. Secondly, judges in Israel, as we know from other trials going on at the minute, I won't get into the details, are afraid of the Attorney General. They have found ways of threatening the careers of judges. And judges are, we know this for certain because some judges have been saying it. Judges fear for their career if they mess with the Attorney General. And imagine what this means. It means that maybe innocent people are sitting in jails because our judges are afraid of our law enforcement. This is dreadful. This is like a police state.
I agree. And all of this is coming out with Netanyahu and his trial. And he's the first among equals, right? I mean, he's the prime minister, and this is what they did. And I think more and more from day to day, everything that we've been contending for the past 5 years since they started this criminal probe against him based on literally nothing, is now coming out. And the question is whether it matters, and what's going to happen, and when are we going to have elections, and are they going to be fixed, or are they going to be fair, and how many of these irredentist anti-Israel parties are going to be coming in, and how are the votes going to be counted, and all the rest of it. But in the United States, you're having this trial of this Hillary Clinton campaign attorney, Michael Sussman. And he's being tried for lying to the FBI, the same charge that Michael Flynn, Trump's first national security advisor, was charged with in the same court, not the same judge, but the same court. And the judge himself is tied in with the whole FBI crowd that was involved with the whole Russiagate investigation. He's married to a woman who is Lisa Page's attorney. Lisa Page is one of the FBI officers who was involved with the whole wiretapping of Trump Towers and of his advisors and all the rest of it. And the selection of jurors was pretty amazing. And you look at the difference between the efforts being made, clear efforts, transparent efforts made by Sussman's trial judge to get him off, to exonerate him, to do everything possible to make jurors disregard smoking guns in the evidence that the prosecutors have presented, And on the other hand, even when the prosecutors wanted to drop the case against Michael Flynn, the judge wouldn't let them. And these things are unprecedented in the United States. They're unprecedented in Israel. But this really goes back to the question of the irredentism of the Arabs in Israel, which is that it's not even so much about the Arabs. It's about Israel's ruling class and America's ruling class, that if they're not loyal to the institutions that they control, if they're not loyal to the state that they're ostensibly serving, but they're serving a purpose, maintaining their power or whatever, or a progressive revolution, then we're in a knot, we're in a pickle, because even when justice or when the truth comes out, it doesn't mean that you're going to get an exoneration. It doesn't mean that you're going to get Netanyahu found innocent of all charges by these judges, because they were hand selected by the president of the Supreme Court to convict Netanyahu. So it's very distressing, because the truth keeps coming out over and over and over again. Every single witness that's come up, the prosecution is presenting its case. Every single one of them, I think Filbar is the 15th since it started. All of them have strengthened the case of the defense. All of them have obliterated the prosecution's case, each in their own way. And yet here we are, and we don't know how this is going to proceed. And you laugh and you look how absurd and how ridiculous the prosecution is, but they keep going because they don't seem to be daunted at all by the fact that their case has completely fallen apart. But we just, you know what? I think that truth does will out. I think that things are shifting. They're shifting in the United States. They're shifting in Israel. And I think that what we saw yesterday, you're right, it was incredibly encouraging, because as Itamar Ben-Gvir said on the Temple Mount, Am Yisrael Chai, where we have a great nation, and we're going to have to figure out how to get past this ruling class. But I do have faith that the truth is coming out, and truth will out.
I have faith in numbers, and I think eventually since I come from these circles, I think that we on the outside don't appreciate their hysteria and don't see the sweat buds on their foreheads, because they know that they'll be able to cheat everyone about everything only for so long.
Well, hopefully it won't be much longer, because we can't do with much more of this. In the United States, everybody's looking towards November, and I keep looking towards tomorrow. The sun will come out, just like Annie sang.
Carolyn, we want more of that. We want more of your smile.
Well, it was a great song. I always wanted to be Annie when I was a little girl. So in the meantime, I'll just say, thank you very much for joining me today, Gadi. I'm going to have you back again soon, just because it's now
With
the Carolyn
pleasure.
Glick show without Gadi Taub doesn't mean that Gadi Taub is glad to go away for long. So thanks for coming on today, and we'll see all of you next week. Remember to subscribe to all the channels. Remember to share it with everybody so we can get the good word out. And yes, the sun will come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, Caroline. Bye-bye.
Right, take care. Bye-bye.
All right.